The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, unmarked except for Dr. Marcus Hale's name, written in block letters across brown paper wrapping. No return address, no postage stamp. Someone had hand-delivered it to his office. Marcus set down his coffee and turned the package over in his hands. Light, maybe a book, or he shook it gently, something that shifted inside. After 23 years as a trauma therapist, he'd received his share of unexpected gifts from grateful patients, usually flowers or thank you cards, occasionally something more personal. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a cassette tape in a clear plastic case. No label, no indication of what it contained. Marcus hadn't seen an actual cassette tape in years. Who even owned cassette players anymore? But he did, actually. An old recorder he kept in his desk drawer, a relic from his early days when he'd recorded sessions for note-taking, before digital made everything easier and simultaneously more vulnerable to breaches. Curious, Marcus inserted the tape and pressed play. Static hissed for 3 seconds. Then a voice emerged, male, measured, with the practiced calmness of someone used to being listened to. Session 1. Patient designation. Subject M. This is my first recording, and I'm not sure where to begin. Dr. Reeves always said to start with the earliest memory that feels relevant. So I'll start with the park. Marcus froze. His hand hovered over the stop button. The voice continued. I was 7 years old. My brother Jeremy was 5. We were at Riverside Park, the one with the old carousel. My mother was on a bench reading. She was always reading. Always somewhere else, even when she was right there. Jeremy wanted to ride the carousel. I said no. I wanted to play on the swings. We argued. He started crying. Marcus's mouth went dry. His hand slowly lowered from the recorder. So I pushed him. Not hard, I thought. But he fell backwards, hit his head on the carousel platform. Blood everywhere. My mother screaming. The ambulance. Jeremy crying in the back seat on the way to the hospital. And me sitting there thinking, I did this. I hurt him because I was selfish. No one knew this story. No one. Marcus had never told anyone about that day. Not his ex-wife, not his colleagues, not even the therapist he'd seen briefly in graduate school. It was his secret shame, buried so deep he sometimes went months without thinking about it. Jeremy had been fine. 7 stitches, a mild concussion. But the guilt had never healed. The thing about guilt, the voice on the tape said, is how it shapes you. After that day, I became obsessed with helping others, with fixing the damage I'd caused, even if I could never fix that specific moment. I think that's why I became a therapist, to treat the wound in others that I couldn't treat in myself. Marcus stopped the tape, his hand trembling. This was impossible. Some kind of elaborate prank, maybe. But who would go to such lengths? And how could they know about the park, about Jeremy, about the exact details of that afternoon 40 years ago? He rewound the tape and played it again, listening more carefully this time. The voice was familiar, not just in content, but in tone, rhythm, the slight pause before certain words. It sounded like, no, that was insane. Marcus pulled out his phone and recorded the tape's audio, then uploaded it to a voice analysis app he'd used in forensic cases. The app compared vocal patterns, pitch, timbre, speech patterns. It took 30 seconds to process. The result made his coffee cup slip from his fingers. Match, 98.7% probability, same speaker. The voice on the tape was his own. Marcus spent the rest of the day in a fog, canceling his afternoon appointments with vague excuses about a family emergency. He sat in his office, staring at the cassette tape, as if it might suddenly explain itself. The rational explanations came first. Someone had cloned his voice using AI, piecing together recordings from his podcasts or lecture videos. Deepfake audio had become terrifyingly sophisticated. They'd researched his past, found old records, maybe interviewed family members he'd lost touch with. But the emotional details, the internal thoughts about guilt and becoming a therapist, those weren't in any public record. Those were his private reasonings, known only to himself. At 6 p.m., Marcus locked his office door, drew the blinds, and played the tape again. This time, he let it run past the park story. Session 1 continued. I want to talk about Claire. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Claire Dennison. We met at a conference in Boston, spring of 2019. I was married to Rachel then. Happily, I thought. But Claire saw something in me that Rachel had stopped seeing years ago. Not the successful therapist, not the published author, but the scared child still trying to make up for pushing his brother. Claire made me feel understood. Marcus pressed stop, his breathing shallow. No one knew about Claire. It had been a 3-month affair, passionate and guilt-ridden in equal measure. They'd met in hotel rooms between conferences, exchanged encrypted messages, told elaborate lies to their spouses. It had ended when Claire moved to Seattle for a new position. They'd promised to never contact each other again, and they hadn't. Marcus had never told anyone. The guilt had nearly destroyed him. But confession had seemed worse. It would hurt Rachel for no purpose except his own relief. So he'd buried it, the same way he'd buried the memory of Jeremy and the carousel. How was this voice, his voice, speaking his deepest secrets? Marcus fast-forwarded the tape, heart pounding. The voice continued describing the affair in painful detail. Claire's hotel room in Chicago, the birthmark on her left shoulder, the way she laughed at his jokes that Rachel always found too dark. Every detail, exact, every memory his own. Then the tape said something that made Marcus's world tilt. But the affair isn't the worst thing I've done. That comes later. That comes on October 14th, 2016, on Highway 101, just outside of Newport. Marcus lunged for the stop button, but his hand froze. He knew what came next. God help him, he knew. The voice continued, relentless. I'd been drinking. Not drunk, I told myself. Just 3 glasses of wine at a retirement party for a colleague. I felt fine to drive. It was raining, dark, the roads slick. I was thinking about a patient I'd failed to help, a young man who'd committed suicide the week before. I wasn't paying attention. Stop, Marcus whispered to the empty office. Please, stop. The impact was soft, almost gentle. I thought I'd hit a deer. I stopped the car, got out. But it wasn't a deer. It was a person. A young woman, maybe 25, wearing a gray raincoat. She'd been walking along the shoulder. I'd drifted right, clipped her, sent her flying into the ditch. Marcus was crying now, hands pressed against his face. She was dead. I knew immediately. The angle of her neck, the stillness. I should have called 911, should have stayed, should have confessed. But I panicked. I thought about my career, my family, everything I'd built. So I got back in my car and I drove away. The next day, I heard about it on the news. Sarah Mitchell, 24, hit and run victim, body found by a jogger. No witnesses, no leads. The tape clicked off. Side A finished. Marcus sat in the darkness of his office, shaking. He hadn't thought about Sarah Mitchell in years, had actively avoided thinking about her. The police investigation had gone nowhere. No cameras on that stretch of road, no physical evidence linking him to the scene. He'd gotten away with it. Except he'd never gotten away with it. The guilt had followed him like a shadow, deepening his empathy for patients while hollowing out something essential inside himself. He'd become an even better therapist after that night, as if treating others' pain could somehow balance the cosmic scales, but it never did. The debt remained unpaid. Marcus flipped the tape over with numb fingers. Side B. He pressed play. A different quality to the voice now. Harder, less patient. Hello, Marcus. I'm not just recounting your memories anymore. We're past that now. You're probably wondering how this is possible. How I know everything about you. How I sound exactly like you. The voice paused. And in that pause, Marcus heard something he'd spent decades learning to identify in his patients. Barely contained rage. I'm not an impersonator. I'm not an AI. I'm you, Marcus. The real you. The part you've spent your entire adult life trying to bury under layers of professional compassion and therapeutic wisdom. I'm the scared 7-year-old who hurt his brother. I'm the unfaithful husband who betrayed his wife. I'm the coward who left Sarah Mitchell dying in a ditch. Marcus wanted to turn it off, but couldn't move. You've built this whole career helping others face their trauma, their guilt, their darkest moments. You pioneered empathic audio journaling to help patients externalize their pain. But you never did it yourself, did you? You never turned that mirror inward. You treated everyone except the patient who needed you most, yourself. The voice shifted, becoming almost gentle. So I'm doing it for you. These tapes are your therapy, Marcus, whether you want it or not. The tape ended. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in his living room, bourbon in hand, trying to rationalize what he'd heard. Someone was targeting him. A former patient who'd gained access to his personal history, maybe. Or a colleague jealous of his success. Or his phone buzzed at 2 a.m. A text from an unknown number. Check your office mailbox tomorrow. Session 2 is waiting. Marcus called the number. Disconnected. Untraceable. The next morning, he found another package in his office mailbox, identical to the first. Another cassette tape. His hands shook as he unwrapped it. He knew he shouldn't play it. Should take it to the police. Report the harassment. But something stopped him. Not curiosity exactly. More like a compulsion. Like a patient who can't stop picking at a wound, even though they know it will never heal that way. Marcus inserted the tape and pressed play. Session 2. Today I want to talk about your father. Marcus nearly broke the recorder, throwing it across the room. It clattered against the wall, but kept playing, the voice implacable. Dr. Harold Hale, respected surgeon, distant father. He was proud of you, in his way, but he never said it, never hugged you, never came to your basketball games or school plays. You spent your childhood trying to earn his approval, and your adulthood pretending you didn't care that you never got it. This was too much. These weren't shameful secrets anymore. This was personal pain, the kind Marcus had processed through years of his own therapy. But hearing it spoken in his own voice described with such clinical precision, felt like psychological surgery without anesthesia. He died when you were 35. Heart attack at his desk. You cried at the funeral, but they were complicated tears. Grief, mixed with relief, mixed with anger at yourself for feeling relieved. You never got to tell him you loved him, never got to hear him say it back. That shaped your practice, didn't it? All those patients working through father issues, and you understood them better than they knew. The tape continued describing private moments from Marcus's life, his divorce from Rachel, the isolation he'd felt during COVID, the prescription pills he'd leaned on a little too heavily last winter. Every word was accurate. Every observation cut deep. But it was the final minute of session 2 that made Marcus realize something terrifying. I know what you're thinking, Marcus. You're trying to figure out who's doing this to you, who has access to your history, who could possibly know all these details. But you're asking the wrong question. The right question is, why have I been silent so long? Why did I let you lock me away while you played savior to everyone else? The voice dropped to a whisper. I'm not your stalker, Marcus. I'm your patient, the one you've refused to treat. And every therapy session you conduct with someone else is another session you've denied yourself. How many patients have you helped face their guilt? Hundreds? Thousands? And yet you won't face your own. Click. End of session 2. Over the next week, Marcus received 5 more tapes. Each one arrived, mysteriously, in his mailbox, slipped under his office door, once even left on his car's passenger seat, though he was certain he'd locked it. Session 3 detailed his secret gambling phase in graduate school, when he'd lost $12,000 in online poker and stolen from his mother's savings to cover it. She'd never known, died thinking he was her perfect son. Session 4 described a patient he'd failed, not the one who committed suicide, a different one. A woman named Teresa, who'd confided that her husband was abusing her. Marcus had documented it, followed protocol, but hadn't pushed hard enough. She'd recanted her story, and he'd let it go. 6 months later, her husband put her in the hospital. Marcus had never forgiven himself, but he'd never told anyone either. Session 5 was about his brother Jeremy again, but this time revealing something Marcus had almost forgotten. After the carousel incident, he'd been cruel to Jeremy for months, punishing him with small torments, hiding his toys, blaming him for things he didn't do, making him feel unwanted, all because Marcus couldn't handle his own guilt and needed to make Jeremy somehow culpable for the accident. Session 6 detailed his drinking, the nights alone with a bottle, the mornings he'd shown up to sessions slightly hungover, the patient he'd actually dozed off on once. For just a second, he'd convinced himself, but the patient had noticed. Session 7 described his secret fear, that he wasn't actually good at his job, that all his success was luck and charisma, that his patients got better despite him, not because of him, that he was a fraud wearing a white coat, playing therapist the way he used to play doctor with toy stethoscopes as a child. By the 8th tape, Marcus had stopped going to work. He called in sick, stayed home, drank. The tapes had broken something in him. Or maybe the 8th tape arrived in his mailbox at home. He didn't remember walking to get it, but suddenly he was sitting on his couch, tape in hand, recorder ready. Session 8, final session. Are you ready, Marcus? His own voice, but different now, stronger, more present, less like a recording and more like someone speaking to him in real time. You've been trying to figure out the mechanism. How I'm doing this. Is it trauma? Dissociative identity disorder? Some kind of psychotic break? You're trying to diagnose me because that's how you cope with fear. By categorizing it, naming it, filing it away in the DSM. Marcus realized he'd been doing exactly that, running through diagnostic criteria like prayer beads. But I'm not a disorder, Marcus. I'm integration. For 23 years, you've been treating the broken parts of other people while keeping your own broken parts locked in the basement. You pioneered empathic audio journaling because you understood, instinctively, that speaking your pain aloud is the first step to healing. But you never took that step yourself. The voice softened, became almost kind. These tapes, they're not from someone else. There is no stalker, no hacker, no elaborate conspiracy. You made these recordings, Marcus. You made them in the middle of the night, in states of semi-consciousness, during the dissociative episodes you've been having for years, but refusing to acknowledge. A part of you has been screaming to be heard, and you've been so busy listening to everyone else that you've ignored your own cries for help. Marcus shook his head violently. No, that's not possible. I would remember. But even as he said it, he realized. Would he? How many mornings had he woken up exhausted, with gaps in his memory? How many times had he found his recorder out on his desk, battery drained, and assumed he'd forgotten to turn it off after a session? The voice analysis was correct. The tape continued. It is your voice. The memories are exact because they're your memories. You've been your own patient all along, Marcus. The one you've been treating in the dark when your conscious mind sleeps and your guilt wakes up to speak. Marcus didn't leave his house for 3 days. He re-listened to all 8 tapes, studying them with the clinical detachment he'd use on a patient's case. And with each listening, he saw what he'd been refusing to see. The tapes were made on his recorder. The scratches on the play button matched. The slight warble in the left speaker was identical. The voice wasn't just similar to his. The speech patterns, the particular words he used, the way he cleared his throat before important points. These weren't things an imitator could fake so perfectly. And the timing. Each tape had arrived after nights when he'd blacked out drinking, when he'd wake with no memory of the previous evening. He'd blamed the alcohol, told himself he'd simply passed out. Oh, what if he hadn't passed out? What if he'd been awake, recording, speaking the truths he couldn't bear to speak while sober? On the 4th day, Marcus set up his recorder before bed. He poured himself 3 bourbons, drank them quickly, and waited. His last conscious memory was of lying on the couch, room spinning, feeling himself slip away. The next morning, he woke in his office chair. The recorder's tape had advanced halfway through. With shaking hands, Marcus rewound and played it. His voice. Session 9. I'm tired, Marcus. So tired of being locked away. You think you're protecting yourself by compartmentalizing, by separating the guilt from the daily life. But you're not protecting yourself. You're just creating a prison inside your own mind. And I'm the one serving the sentence. Marcus watched his hand reach toward the recorder, saw his fingers press stop, rewind, play. He had no memory of this, no awareness of sitting here, speaking these words. You need to understand something. I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm trying to save you. Every patient you help face their truth. You're living vicariously through their healing because you're too scared to heal yourself. You're an empathy vampire, feeding on their catharsis while denying your own. The voice, His voice cracked with emotion. Do you know what it's like? Being the part of you that holds all the pain, all the shame, all the truth, while the rest of you walks around pretending to be whole, healthy, healed. I'm drowning, Marcus. And you're drowning too. You're just too busy swimming to notice the water filling your lungs. On the tape, he heard himself crying. Great, heaving sobs that he didn't remember producing. Sarah Mitchell haunts me. Every day, every session where you help someone process grief or guilt, I'm there, screaming, what about Sarah? What about the woman you killed and left in a ditch? When do we face that? Marcus stopped the tape, sat in the morning light of his office, looked at his hands, the hands that had gripped a steering wheel on a rainy night, the hands that had lifted a bottle instead of a phone to call for help. He was dissociating. Had been for years. Childhood trauma, compounded by adult guilt, manifested as a split between his professional self and his truthful self. The empathic audio journaling technique he'd pioneered for his patients had become, unconsciously, a way for his suppressed self to finally speak. He'd been treating himself in his sleep, his own therapist and his own patient, having sessions he couldn't remember, leaving recordings as evidence of the work being done in the shadows of his consciousness. Marcus grabbed his phone and called his former supervisor, Dr. Ellen Reeves. She answered on the third ring. Ellen, it's Marcus Hale. I need help. Those 4 words, I need help, felt like confession and relief in equal measure. Dr. Reeves met him that afternoon at her office. Marcus brought all the tapes, played them for her, explained what he'd discovered. She listened without judgment, the way he'd listened to hundreds of patients over the years. You're experiencing dissociative episodes, triggered by unprocessed trauma and guilt, she said. The recordings are your unconscious mind's attempt to force integration, to make you face what you've been avoiding. But they feel like someone else, like I'm being stalked by myself, because you've created such a strong separation between your professional persona and your authentic self. The voice on the tapes isn't a different person. It's you, the you that you've exiled, the you that's been trying to come home. Marcus sat back, exhausted. What do I do? What you've told thousands of patients to do. Face it. Really face it. No more compartmentalization. No more burying. You need to integrate these parts of yourself, which means you need to stop running from your guilt. Sarah Mitchell needs acknowledgement. So does Jeremy, though your childhood accident was just that, an accident. So does Claire. So does Rachel. All the wounds you've left unhealed. You can't therapize your way out of this, Marcus. You have to live through it. Over the next weeks, Marcus began the painful work of integration. He met with Ellen 3 times a week. He started his own audio journal, conscious this time, deliberate, speaking aloud the things he'd never said. His guilt over Sarah Mitchell, his regret over the affair with Claire, his grief over his father's emotional distance, his cruelty to Jeremy. He listened to the tapes Ellen suggested he make during the day, comparing them to the ones he'd made unconsciously at night. Slowly, the gap between them narrowed. The voice that had seemed like a stranger became recognizable as his own. Not different, just unfiltered. His lawyer said he'd likely face manslaughter charges, possibly vehicular homicide. Prison time was almost certain. Marcus called Rachel before the arraignment. I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago. He confessed about Claire, about the lies, about the guilt that had poisoned their marriage. even as he'd pretended everything was fine. Rachel was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was hard. I knew, not the details, but I knew something had happened. I could feel it, and I stayed anyway because I hoped you'd trust me enough to tell me the truth. But you never did. I'm sorry. So am I. She hung up. Marcus sat in his cell. He'd been denied bail and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness, not absolution. Just the deep relief of finally stopping the pretense. That night, for the first time in months, he didn't have a dissociative episode. Didn't wake up to find tapes he couldn't remember making. The voice that had haunted him was quiet. Not because it was gone, but because he'd finally started listening. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Marcus pleaded guilty to vehicular manslaughter and leaving the scene of an accident. The prosecutor was aggressive, painting him as a privileged professional who'd thought himself above the law. The defense tried to emphasize his remorse, his confession, his otherwise clean record. Sarah Mitchell's family sat in the front row every day. Her mother, her younger brother, her fiancé who she'd never gotten to marry. Marcus made himself look at them, absorb their grief, acknowledge the crater his cowardice had created in their lives. On the witness stand, Marcus told the truth, all of it. The wine, the distraction, the impact, the panic, the decision to flee. He didn't minimize or justify. He simply testified to what he'd done. Why come forward now? The prosecutor asked. After 8 years? Marcus thought about the tapes, about the voice that had forced him to confront himself. Because I was tired of being two people. The man I pretended to be, and the man I actually was. My entire career has been about helping others integrate their trauma, face their truth. I finally realized I had to do the same, regardless of consequences. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 4. Dr. Hale, she said, you spent decades helping others heal. Perhaps now you can focus on healing yourself. In prison, Marcus had a lot of time to think. He read, meditated, attended the therapy groups offered to inmates. He wrote long letters to Jeremy, apologizing for childhood cruelties that his brother barely remembered, but that had haunted Marcus for years. Jeremy wrote back, I forgave you for that when I was 8. I just wish you'd forgiven yourself sooner. Marcus wrote to Rachel, not asking for forgiveness, but offering honest apology for his betrayal. She didn't respond for 6 months. When she finally did, the letter was short. I appreciate your honesty now. I wish you'd offered it when it could have mattered to us. I'm moving on. I hope you find peace. He wrote to Claire, who responded immediately, also confessing guilt they'd both carried. They exchanged a few letters, then mutually agreed to stop. Some chapters needed to close, not continue, and he wrote to Sarah Mitchell's family. Her mother responded with a letter that Marcus read 20 times. I don't forgive you, but I appreciate that you finally told the truth. My daughter's death has a face now, a name, an explanation. That doesn't heal the wound, but it helps stop the wondering. 18 months into his sentence, Marcus sat in his cell one evening and set up the small tape recorder inmates were allowed for personal use. He pressed record. Session. I don't know what number we're on anymore. It doesn't matter. I'm not making these for the dissociated self anymore. I'm making them because I've learned that speaking the truth is how you stay truthful. His voice was steady, calm, integrated. I'm Marcus Hale. I'm a therapist who helped hundreds of people face their trauma while running from my own. I'm a man who hurt his brother as a child and turned that guilt into a career. I'm an unfaithful husband who betrayed the woman I loved. I'm a coward who left someone to die and spent 8 years pretending it didn't happen. He paused, considering. I'm also someone who's learning to integrate these truths, to be whole instead of fractured. The voice that haunted me, my own voice, speaking from the darkness, isn't separate anymore. It's just me, all of me, the good and the terrible, the healer and the wounded, the helper and the one who needs help. Marcus stopped recording, rewound, and played it back. His voice sounded different now, not split between conscious and unconscious, but unified, honest, whole. The next morning, he received a letter from the state licensing board. His medical license had been permanently revoked. He would never practice therapy again. The news should have devastated him, but instead, Marcus felt oddly liberated. He'd become a therapist to heal the wound in himself by healing it in others. But vicarious healing wasn't real healing. It was just another way of avoiding the work. Now, he had no choice but to do his own work, to face his own pain, to speak his own truth. 3 years into his sentence, Marcus was granted parole. He walked out of prison into a world that had moved on without him. His house had been sold to pay legal fees. His professional reputation was ruined. His marriage was over. His career was finished. He was 53 years old and starting over with nothing but the truth. 5 years after his release, Marcus worked as a counselor at a community center in Portland, helping people navigate addiction and trauma. The pay was minimal. The work exhausting, but it was honest. He wasn't Dr. Hale anymore, acclaimed author and pioneer of therapeutic techniques. He was just Marcus, a man who'd made terrible mistakes and was trying to live differently. He still did audio journals, but now they were conscious, deliberate, integrated. He recorded his thoughts, his struggles, his ongoing work to remain honest with himself. The dissociative episodes had stopped. The voice that had haunted him was gone, not because he'd silenced it, but because he'd finally learned to speak with it instead of against it. One evening, a young woman came to the center for her intake appointment, 28, struggling with guilt over a car accident that had killed her best friend. "I was driving," she sobbed. "It was my fault. Everyone says it's not, but I know the truth, and I can't live with it." Marcus listened, really listened, the way he'd learned to listen to himself. "Tell me about it," he said gently. "All of it. The truth isn't something you have to carry alone." As she spoke, Marcus thought about the tapes, the voice, the years he'd spent fractured. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, whose death he couldn't undo, but could finally acknowledge. He thought about the prison cell, where he'd learned that confession isn't weakness. It's the only path to strength. "The guilt won't disappear," he told the young woman when she finished. "But it will change. It can become something that makes you more compassionate, more honest, more human." "That's not absolution. It's integration." She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "How do you know?" Marcus smiled sadly. "Because I spent 23 years trying to heal others without healing myself, and it nearly destroyed me. The wounds we refuse to treat are the ones that fester the longest." That night, Marcus made his daily recording. His voice was tired but peaceful. Session 5 years, 4 months, and 12 days since integration. "Today I helped someone face their guilt. Not by telling them how to escape it, but by showing them how to live with it honestly. I think that's what healing actually is. Not the absence of pain, but the integration of it. The acceptance that we are, all of us, broken in some way, and that's okay. That's human." He paused, then added, I used to think the voice on those tapes was trying to destroy me. Now I understand it was trying to save me. It was the part of myself that loved me enough to refuse to let me keep lying. We do that sometimes. We love ourselves by telling ourselves the hardest truths, by refusing to look away from who we really are. Marcus stopped recording and played it back. His voice sounded clear, whole, honest. Not the dissociated whisper of a man at war with himself, but the integrated voice of someone who'd finally, painfully, become one person instead of two. Outside his window, Portland glittered in the dark. Somewhere in that city were people like him, people carrying secrets, people fractured by guilt, people at war with their own truth. Some of them would find their way to integration. Others would spend their lives running, creating elaborate masks, becoming strangers to themselves. Marcus hoped they found their own voices before those voices had to hunt them down in the dark. He turned off the light and went to bed, and for the first time in decades, he slept without dreaming of tapes appearing in the morning. The patient within had finally been heard, and in being heard, had finally been healed.